There are moments in life when circumstances feel final. Doors close, opportunities disappear, prayers seem unanswered, and hope feels stretched thin. You look at your situation and quietly conclude, this cannot change. But that is exactly where human limitation ends and where divine possibility begins. Because what is impossible for man is never impossible for God. There are seasons when life teaches you the language of delay. You pray, but the answer does not come quickly. You believe, but nothing seems to shift. You try again, but results remain the same. In those moments, it is easy to assume that silence means absence. But silence is not absence, it is preparation. Behind what you cannot see, something is already moving. The truth is, divine timing never matches human urgency. What feels delayed is often being developed. What feels denied is often being refined. And what feels impossible is often simply not ready yet in your understanding of God's plan. When God moves, he does. He does not need permission from circumstances. He does not require favorable conditions. He does not wait for the odds to improve. He steps into situations that are already written off and rewrites them with authority. Think about how impossibility looks through human eyes. A dead end, a closed womb, a blocked road, a broken body, a ruined opportunity, a shattered dream. These are the places where human strength stops working. But these are also the exact places where divine power begins to reveal itself. Because God specializes in reversing conclusions. He brings life where there is death. He brings order where there is chaos. He brings direction where there is confusion. He brings restoration where everything looks lost. Not because circumstances are easy, but because his power is greater than circumstances. And often, before the miracle happens outside, something must first happen inside. Faith must rise where fear once lived. Trust must grow where doubt once ruled. Peace must settle where anxiety once controlled the mind. Because the real miracle is not only what changes around you, but what changes within you. There is a shift that happens when you stop measuring your situation by your ability and start measuring it by God's authority. Suddenly, the impossible no longer feels final. It feels temporary. It no longer feels like a wall. It feels like a setup for a breakthrough. You may be standing in front of something that looks immovable, but remember this: what is immovable to you is never immovable to God. What feels permanent to you is never permanent in his hands. There is a moment when divine intervention steps into natural limitation. And when that happens, what no human effort could accomplish begins to unfold with clarity and power. Doors that were locked begin to open. Paths that were hidden begin to appear. Opportunities that were delayed begin to align. Not because you forced it, but because he moved. So the call is not to panic in the impossible, but to remain steady in faith. Not to surrender to fear, but to stand in trust. Not to give up in confusion, but to hold on in confidence. Because when God moves, the impossible does not resist, it responds. And what once looked like the end becomes the beginning of a testimony. There is a point in every human journey where effort reaches its limit. You try harder, think longer, plan better, and still you arrive at the same wall. It is the moment when skill is no longer enough, when experience cannot provide answers, and when even the most determined mindset begins to feel the weight of limitation. This is the space where impossibility becomes visible, not because everything is truly over, but because human strength has reached its boundary. Impossibility in this sense is not just a situation, it is an awareness. It is the recognition that what stands before you cannot be solved by the tools you normally rely on. It may appear in different forms. For one person, it is financial praise. Sure, that keeps growing despite every effort to stabilize it. For another, it is a health report that changes the direction of life in an instant. For someone else, it may be a broken relationship that no conversation seems to heal, or a dream that feels permanently out of reach no matter how much passion is invested into it. In these moments, human strength begins to reveal its boundaries. And that realization is not easy to accept. Most people spend their lives believing that persistence alone can fix anything, that intelligence can solve every puzzle, and that time and effort will eventually open every door. But life has a way of confronting those beliefs with situations that refuse to respond to human control. Yet this is precisely where something deeper begins to unfold. When human strength ends, it does not mean everything ends. It simply means another source must begin to operate. There is a transition point where self-reliance gives way to dependence on something greater than and personal ability. And although that transition can feel uncomfortable, even disorienting, it is often the beginning of real transformation. Impossibility has a strange purpose. It strips away the illusion of control. It removes the confidence placed in limited resources. It exposes how fragile human certainty can be. But at the same time, it opens the door to a different kind of awareness, the realization that not everything depends on human hands alone. In that space, people often discover that what they thought was the end was actually a turning point. The pressure that seemed unbearable begins to shift perspective. The situation that felt permanently stuck begins to reveal new angles that were not visible before. Not because the circumstance changed immediately, but because perception begins to change first. There is something powerful about reaching the edge of human ability. It forces a person to stop depending only on what they can do and start considering what can be done beyond them. It challenges pride, softens self-reliance, and creates room for a different kind of strength, one that is not rooted in control, but in trust. This does not mean effort becomes meaningless. Effort still matters. Wisdom still matters. Responsibility still matters. But there comes a point where effort alone cannot carry the full weight of a situation. And recognizing that point is not weakness, it is clarity. It is the understanding that life was never designed to be sustained by human strength alone. When people find themselves in impossible situations, they often feel isolated, as if they are the first to ever face such limitations. But impossibility is a shared human experience. Everyone at some stage encounters something they cannot fix, cannot predict, and cannot fully understand. And in those moments, something subtle begins to happen within the human spirit. The focus shifts from what is visible to what is not yet visible, from what is failing to what might still be, possible beyond immediate understanding. That shift is where real change begins to form. Not always instantly, not always in obvious ways, but gradually as perspective expands beyond limitation. What once felt like a closed chapter begins to feel like a paused moment. What once felt like defeat begins to feel like positioning. Because when human strength ends, it is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a different kind of working, one that does not rely on human limitation to define outcomes. Delay is one of the most difficult experiences for the human mind to interpret. When something is desired, expected, or deeply needed, time begins to feel different. Every passing moment feels heavier, every unanswered situation feels louder, and every quiet day feels like a statement of absence. In those seasons, delay is often misunderstood as rejection, and silence is often mistaken for abandonment. But what feels like a delay is not always a denial, it is often a process unfolding. Beyond immediate perception, human nature is built around urgency. People want answers quickly, solutions immediately, and breakthroughs without prolonged waiting. There is an internal resistance to anything that stretches beyond personal timelines. But life does not always operate within human expectations. There are moments when circumstances do not move at the pace of desire. And in those moments, the real challenge is not only the waiting itself, but the interpretation of the waiting. When things do not happen on time, the mind naturally begins to create assumptions. Doubt enters quietly. Questions begin to multiply. Why is this taking so long? Did I do something wrong? Has the opportunity passed? These thoughts do not always reflect reality, but they reflect emotional pressure. And under that pressure, delay begins to feel like failure. However, delay carries a deeper dimension that is often unseen. What is not visible in waiting seasons is the shaping process happening beneath the surface. While nothing appears to be changing externally, internal preparation is often taking place. Character is being strengthened in ways that success alone could never develop. Patience is being refined in ways that comfort could never teach. and perception is being adjusted in ways that instant results would never allow. There are outcomes in life that require alignment, not just desire, and alignment takes time. Just because something is desired does not mean every condition surrounding it is ready. Sometimes the environment, the timing, or even the internal readiness of a person needs adjustment before what is sought can fully manifest in a sustainable way. This is why delay should not always be interpreted as absence of progress. Progress is not always visible. A seed planted underground does not show immediate results, yet beneath the surface, growth is actively taking place. Roots are expanding, structure is forming, and preparation for future stability is happening, ending long before anything appears above the ground. In the same way, what looks like nothing happening may actually be something important happening out of sight. Delay also has a way of protecting individuals from premature outcomes. Not everything that is desired is ready to be received at any given moment. There are situations where early arrival could lead to instability, mismanagement, or unprepared responsibility. In such cases, waiting is not punishment, it is preservation. It ensures that when something finally arrives, it arrives into a space that can sustain it properly. Another aspect of delay is that it reveals what truly exists within the heart. When things come quickly and easily, it is difficult to understand the depth of one's trust, patience, or emotional resilience. But when waiting stretches longer than expected, inner qualities begin to surface. Doubt and trust are both exposed in such seasons. Fear and faith both become visible. And through that exposure, our growth becomes possible. It is also in seasons of delay that perspective begins to mature. What once seemed urgent begins to lose its pressure. What once felt like the only path begins to expand into other possibilities. The mind slowly transitions from narrow expectation to broader understanding. And in that expansion, peace begins to replace panic. Many people look back on delayed seasons and realize later that what felt like a setback was actually a redirection. What felt like a pause was actually preparation for something more suitable, more stable, or more aligned than originally expected. The benefit of hindsight often reveals that timing plays a greater role than emotion can understand in the moment. Delay, therefore, is not simply a gap between request and response. It is a space where transformation quietly occurs. It is where endurance is built, where understanding deepens, and where hidden preparation takes place. What seems like inactivity is often structured activity, beyond immediate awareness. So even when nothing appears to be changing, it does not mean nothing is happening. It simply means the process is still unfolding in a way that cannot yet be seen, but will eventually become clear when timing aligns with purpose. When circumstances feel overwhelming, human instinct is to look for control. People naturally try to manage outcomes through planning, effort, negotiation, or persistence. These are important tools in daily life, but they all share one limitation: they depend on conditions being favorable. When conditions become unpredictable, when systems fail, when doors remain closed despite repeated attempts, human control reaches its boundary. It is in that space that a different principle becomes visible. Outcomes are not only shaped by effort, but also by forces beyond effort. This understanding challenges one of the deepest assumptions people carry, that if something is difficult enough, more effort will eventually solve it. While persist. NCE has value, life consistently demonstrates that not everything responds to force or repetition. Some situations require transformation, not just adjustment. Some realities require change at the source, not just improvement on the surface. And that is where the idea of a higher governing authority over circumstances becomes significant. When circumstances are viewed only through human capability, limitations appear final. A locked door is just a locked door. A medical report is just a fixed outcome. A financial crisis is just a mathematical constraint. But when perspective expands beyond human limitation, those same situations are no longer viewed as permanent structures. They become flexible realities subject to change from outside the system that created them. This does not mean ignoring responsibility or abandoning effort. Instead, it means recognizing that effort is not the highest power in operation. Effort is participation, not control. It is action within a larger framework. That also includes timing, alignment, and influence beyond visible systems. When this realization begins to take root, pressure starts to shift. The burden of needing to fix everything personally begins to ease. One of the most important aspects of this truth is the understanding that circumstances are not self-sustaining in their final form. What appears fixed is often only fixed within the limits of human perception, but perception is not the same as reality. There are moments when what seems irreversible is actually still in motion beneath the surface. Processes that cannot be detected by human observation may already be working toward change. This is why reliance on a higher authority over outcomes becomes essential in seasons of uncertainty. It removes the illusion that everything depends solely on personal strength. That illusion is heavy because it places total responsibility for outcomes on limited human capacity. And limited capacity was never designed to carry unlimited print. Escher, when trust shifts from personal control to a greater governing source, something internal changes. Fear loses some of its authority. Anxiety loses some of its intensity. The constant need to force results begins to soften. This does not mean challenges disappear instantly, but the internal response to challenges begins to transform. Instead of panic, there is patience. Instead of desperation, there is steadiness. Instead of collapse under pressure, there is endurance through it. Another important dimension of this understanding is the recognition that authority over circumstances is not dependent on visible conditions. In human systems, authority is often linked to position, resources, or influence. But true authority over life's deepest challenges is not limited by those factors. It is not weakened by distance, time, or complexity. It operates beyond the boundaries that restrict human capability. This is why situations that appear immovable can still change unexpectedly. Number T, because effort suddenly became stronger, but because influence beyond effort became active. When that shift occurs, outcomes that seemed locked begin to loosen. Paths that seemed blocked begin to open. Solutions that were previously invisible begin to appear with clarity. In such moments, the focus moves away from obsession with control and toward alignment with trust. Trust does not mean inactivity, it means stability in the midst of uncertainty. It means continuing to move forward without carrying the emotional burden of forcing outcomes. It means doing what is within reach while releasing what is beyond reach to a higher governing hand. Over time, this shift produces a deeper form of strength. It is not the strength of constant control, but the strength of steady confidence. A confidence that is not easily shaken by delays, setbacks, or unpredictability. Because the outcome is no longer viewed as dependent solely on human limitation, but also on a greater authority capable of transforming limitation itself. And in that realization, pressure is replaced with peace, striving is replaced with trust, and uncertainty is met not with fear, but with assurance that outcomes are not confined to what human ability alone can achieve. When life is examined closely, it becomes clear that the most important battles are not always visible on the outside. Many people focus on external change, situations improving, doors opening, problems disappearing, but beneath all of that, there is an internal world that often determines how those external realities are experienced. Fear, doubt, anxiety, and uncertainty do not simply appear because of circumstances, they grow in response to how circumstances are interpreted. That is why the greatest transformation often begins not in the situation itself, but within the individual facing it. When pressure builds, the natural human response is emotional instability. The mind begins to project worst-case scenarios. Thoughts become repetitive, and heavy. The heart becomes restless, constantly searching for answers that are not yet available. In this state, external problems are often magnified internally. A situation that may already be difficult becomes even heavier because of the internal interpretation attached to it. This is where fear quietly takes root. Fear is not always loud. Sometimes it is subtle. It appears as hesitation, overthinking, avoidance, or constant worry about outcomes. It creates a sense of limitation that goes beyond the actual facts of the situation. And when fear becomes the dominant internal voice, it begins to shape perception. What could be seen as temporary begins to feel permanent. What could be seen as manageable begins to feel overwhelming. What could be seen as uncertain begins to feel hopeless. This is why inner transformation becomes essential before external resolution can be fully appreciated. A change in circumstances without a change in mindset often leads to temporary relief rather than lasting peace. But when the internal world begins to shift even before the external situation changes, something powerful happens. Perception becomes aligned with stability rather than panic. Faith in this context is not simply a belief that everything will instantly improve. It is a deeper internal posture of trust that allows a person to remain steady even when outcomes are not visible. It is the ability to stand in uncertainty without collapsing under it. It does not deny reality, but it refuses to be controlled by fear-based interpretations of reality. When faith begins to rise within a person, it does not always remove the external challenge immediately, but it changes the way the challenge is carried. The weight feels different. The emotional pressure becomes more manageable. The constant mental noise begins to quiet down. Instead of being driven by panic, decisions begin to be guided by clarity. Instead of reacting impulsively, there is space for thoughtful response. This shift is significant because many struggles are intensified not by the situation itself, but by the internal response to it. When fear is dominant, even small problems feel large. When faith begins to grow, even large problems begin to feel less controlling. The situation may remain the same externally, but internally, the balance of power begins to change. Trust plays a key role in this transformation. Trust is the ability to release the need to constantly control outcomes mentally. It does not mean passivity or resignation. Rather, it is an intentional decision to stop allowing uncertainty to dominate emotional stability. Trust creates space for calmness where anxiety once lived. It allows the mind to rest instead of constantly racing toward unknown conclusions. As fear decreases and trust increases, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Peace begins to establish itself in the inner world. This peace is not dependent on circumstances aligning perfectly. Instead, it is rooted in the ability to remain grounded even when circumstances are unstable. It becomes a steady anchor in the midst of shifting conditions. This internal peace has a direct impact on how life is experienced. Decisions become clearer, reactions become calmer, hope becomes more consistent. The emotional extremes that once dominated thinking begin to lose their control. And in their place, a quiet confidence begins to form, not confidence in circumstances, but confidence in the ability to remain steady through them. The transformation from fear to faith is not always immediate. It often happens gradually through repeated moments of choosing trust over anxiety, calm over panic, and perspective over assumption. Each moment of choosing differently strengthens the internal foundation. Over time, what once felt unstable begins to feel grounded. In this way, the greatest miracle is not only when external situations change, but when the internal response to those situations is complete. Why transformed? Because when the inner world is no longer ruled by fear, even uncertainty can be faced with strength, and even difficulty can be walked through with peace that does not easily collapse. When people face situations that feel immovable, there is a natural tendency to assume that what is currently visible is the final state of things. A closed door feels like a permanent closure. A broken situation feels like something beyond repair. A long-standing delay feels like confirmation that nothing will ever change. Human perception tends to freeze circumstances in their present condition, as if the current moment defines the final outcome. But life repeatedly shows that what appears fixed is often only fixed within the limits of human observation, not within the limits of possibility itself. A closed door, in practical terms, simply means access is not available at that moment. It does not define whether access will remain unavailable forever. Yet when emotions are involved, personally, perception often turns temporary barriers into permanent conclusions. This is where misunderstanding begins. What is momentarily inaccessible is often interpreted as permanently impossible. But time has a way of revealing that many final situations were never final at all. When change eventually occurs in situations that once seemed impossible, it challenges the assumption that things were truly static. It becomes clear that what was seen was only one phase of a larger process. Behind visible circumstances, there are often layers of development that are not immediately detectable. While outward conditions appear unchanged, internal or unseen shifts may already be taking place. These shifts are not always noticeable in the moment, but they become evident when outcomes begin to unfold differently than expected. This is why it is important not to define situations solely by their current appearance. Appearance is only a snapshot of a moment in time, not the full story. A snapshot capture. What is visible at a single instant, but it does not capture movement, transition, or potential. Yet human thinking often treats that snapshot as the complete narrative. This is how limitation becomes mentally reinforced. What feels like a dead end may actually be a pause in progress that is not yet visible. What feels like loss may actually be repositioning for something different. What feels like delay may actually be restructuring of timing and alignment. These interpretations are not always immediately obvious, but they become clearer when perspective expands beyond the immediate moment. One of the most important realizations in such situations is that transformation often begins in ways that cannot be seen first. Before external change becomes visible, there are often unseen developments that prepare the foundation for it. Just as natural processes take place beneath the surface before they emerge into visibility, many life situations also develop beyond what the eyes can perceive. Dietly detect. Because of this, it is not accurate to assume that nothing is happening simply because nothing is visible. Visibility and activity are not always the same thing. There are processes that require time before they become observable. During that time, it may appear as though everything is stagnant, but stagnation is often only perceived, not actual. When eventual change does occur, it often feels sudden to those observing from the outside. But from a broader perspective, that change is usually the result of gradual unfolding that was not previously seen. What appeared to be an instant shift was often the culmination of unseen preparation over time. This is why conclusions based only on current conditions are often incomplete. Another important aspect of this truth is that circumstances are not self-defining in their permanence. A situation does not declare its own finality. It is human interpretation that assigns permanence to it. And interpretation can change as under. Tanding deepens. When interpretation shifts, the meaning of the situation also shifts. What once felt like a permanent structure begins to feel like a temporary phase. This shift in understanding is powerful because it changes emotional response. When something is seen as permanent, it produces resignation or fear. But when the same situation is seen as temporary or transitional, it produces patience and resilience. The situation itself may not change immediately, but the internal experience of it changes significantly. Over time, this change in perception allows individuals to remain steadier in uncertain conditions. Instead of reacting based on finality, they begin to respond based on possibility. Instead of concluding too early, they begin to remain open to what has not yet unfolded. This openness creates space for hope to remain active even in difficult circumstances. And often when outcomes eventually shift, it becomes clear that what once looked like an ending was never truly an ending at all. It was simply a moment within a larger unfolding process that only revealed its full meaning with time. When people think about change, they often imagine visible movement, doors opening, situations improving, problems disappearing, and opportunities arriving in clear and measurable ways. But transformation is not always immediately visible. In fact, some of the most important changes begin in ways that cannot be seen, touched, or easily measured. They begin beneath the surface of life, in places where awareness is limited but activity is still taking place. It is a common human assumption that if something is not visible, it is not happening. This assumption feels logical because human perception relies heavily on sight and immediate evidence. However, life processes are not always designed to align with instant visibility. Many developments require time before they can be recognized. During that time, it may appear as though nothing is happening, but that appears. E can be misleading. There are countless examples in natural processes that reflect this principle. Growth often begins underground before anything appears above the surface. Development often takes place internally before it becomes externally observable. Preparation often occurs quietly before manifestation becomes visible. These patterns suggest that visibility is not the same as activity, and absence of visible change is not proof of absence of progress. In human experience, similar patterns unfold. Situations that feel stagnant may actually be in a phase of preparation. Changes that seem delayed may actually be in the process of alignment. Outcomes that appear distant may already be moving closer through steps that are not yet recognizable. But because these processes are not immediately visible, they are often misunderstood. This misunderstanding can lead to frustration. When people do not see results quickly, they begin to assume that nothing is working. This assumption can weaken patience and increase emotional pressure. The mind begins to interpret silence as inactivity and delay as failure. But in reality, many processes require silence in order to properly develop. There is also a deeper layer to this idea. Some changes require not only time, but also coordination of multiple factors. Timing, readiness, environment, and internal alignment all play a role in shaping outcomes. When these elements are still aligning, external change may not yet be visible. But behind the scenes, adjustment is still taking place. This is why patience is not passive. It is observant endurance. It is the ability to remain steady without demanding immediate proof of progress. It recognizes that processes can be active even when outcomes are not yet visible. This perspective allows individuals to avoid premature conclusions about situations that are still unfolding. Often, what appears to be inactivity is actually a phase of restructuring. Systems are adjusting, conditions are aligning, and unseen elements are preparing for a future shift. These phases are essential because they create stability for what comes next. Without unseen preparation, visible outcomes would lack foundation. When change finally becomes visible, it can appear sudden, but that suddenness is often an illusion created by limited observation. What is seen at the moment of change is only the final stage of a longer process. The earlier stages, which were not visible, were just as important as the final moment. They formed the groundwork that made the visible shift possible. This understanding helps reshape how waiting is experienced. Instead of interpreting waiting as emptiness, it can be understood as active preparation. Instead of viewing silence as absence, it can be viewed as development that has not yet reached visibility. This shift in perception reduces frustration and strengthens endurance. It also helps reduce the emotional pressure that comes from comparing current conditions. On with expected outcomes. When expectations are tied only to visible results, any delay feels like loss. But when it is understood that progress can exist without visibility, patience becomes more sustainable. Over time, this awareness builds resilience.